If you can't finish a mix in one day, like 8 hours or less, you're doing it wrong. And let's face it, once you're 8 hours deep into a mix, you're probably not gonna make it any better, you're just tweaking in circles. The first way to mix faster is to avoid using the solo button. It's mostly a waste of time. It literally doesn't matter what something sounds like in solo because no one else will ever hear it like that. And yes, solo is useful to kind of zoom in on a problem and fix something that you heard, but most of us would have to admit that mixing in solo is kind of addictive because it makes it feel a lot easier to process a sound and fool yourself that you're making the right decisions. But you gotta fight that addiction. Force yourself to make all of your EQ, compression, effects, really all of your mix decisions in the context of the entire mix. You're gonna make better decisions, you'll probably make them faster, and you'll also save a lot of time because you won't end up going down rabbit holes focusing on problems that really don't matter in the grand scheme of things. My next piece of advice is to use simpler plugins. The more knobs and controls and options there are on a plugin, the longer it's gonna take you to dial it in, if only for the temptation to try out all of those other features. And that's why I've been using an SSL channel plugin for over a decade as my main go-to EQ. It's got 4 bands of EQ, no crazy visual graphs to freak me out or distract me, and a really simple compressor with 4 controls. That's it. You don't want to have this false sense of pride in manually twisting and turning every knob. I mean, at this point, I prefer plugins that will get me to the end result I want with as little tweaking and changing as possible. I'm building an entire plugin company based on that foundation. Hey, if you want a free guide to simplify your mixing process, check out my mixing cheat sheet. It's got all of my go-to EQ and compression moves for each track in the mix. And if you follow this chart and use these settings as a starting point, your mixes are gonna start to sound better. So you can grab that for free at mixcheatsheet.com, or there's a link in the description below. Tip number 3 is to get a control surface. I feel so slow and cramped when I don't have any physical faders in front of me. Ever since I've started, I've had some version of a control surface. I do a lot of automation in my mixes, so it's essential for me to have some physical faders there that I can physically ride during that process and not try to draw it all in with a mouse. And even just having one fader, like the PreSonus fader port, is still gonna save you a lot of time when you're automating your mixes. But even in the early setup process, I love having more than one fader. I like having 8 faders in front of me. I can jump around, I can use 2 hands at the same time, balance multiple tracks, grab that pan knob. I think it's a huge time saver and it just feels better. The 4th way to mix faster is to get rid of all distractions. Email, text messages, social media, yeah, even YouTube. It's all killing your ability to focus and be productive. So put your phone in another room when you're mixing. Silence all the notifications on your computer. Resist that urge to go and check your email or refresh the YouTube feed in the middle of a mix. Now, there's a ton of research on this that you've probably heard already, but simply put, every time you stop mixing and go and look at something else, it's gonna take you a bunch of extra time just to get your mind back to where it was when you stopped. And our addiction to content and media is just insane these days. It's honestly really hard to manage for everyone. And that's why I think that the ability to get rid of distractions and actually focus and do deep work, it kind of separates the men from the boys. Number 5, commit to a deadline. As soon as you book a new project, set an end date and hold yourself to it. I guarantee this is gonna help you mix faster because at a certain point, you have no choice. You just have to finish the thing. Now, this is harder to do if you're only working on your own music. So if that's you, you've got to bring in some outside accountability. For example, you could book a mastering date before you even start mixing, or you could announce the release date to your followers before you even start the project. Whatever you do, it's good to get yourself on the hook to finish it on time. Number 6, use reference tracks strategically. Now, I say that because referencing is either going to destroy your mixing speed and confidence, or it's going to help you get to the finish line faster. So if you pick one reference track and you really analyze it in depth against your mix, you're gonna get stuck. The key is to reference very quickly, and you wanna bounce around between 5 different songs. Just listen to 3 or 5 seconds of each song and then bounce back to your mix, and you'll be able to tell pretty quickly whether you're heading in the right direction and what is still lacking overall in your work. You don't wanna get sucked down into analyzing individual details like the kick sound or guitar tone on a reference track versus your mix. You just want to get a sense of the overall ballpark and amount of low end and mid range, high end and punch, and make sure that your mix is living in that same ballpark. Another thing that helps a lot with that is to listen on real world speakers before the very end. You know, everyone knows about checking your final mix in the car after you finish it, but you can actually save yourself some time by applying that concept earlier on. You know, for me, outside of the studio, I spend most of my music listening time on these things, Apple AirPods. You know, at this point, I instinctively know what a mix should sound like on these. It's kind of like my new car test. But recently, instead of waiting to the end of the mix to check it on AirPods, I've started popping them in during the mix. And actually at this point, I'll spend maybe a third of my time mixing a song, listening on these and actually making mix decisions with the AirPods. And it works because this is a real world device that millions of people listen to music on. So if I can get it sounding right in here, I'm pretty confident that it's gonna translate. And sometimes it's hard to have that confidence in translation on studio monitors. So whatever the real world device of choice is for you, find ways to bring that into your actual mix process. Tip number 8 is to follow the same mix process every time. This is where the constant bombardment of content and tips and opinions can really mess you up, because it causes you to keep trying different approaches to how you mix. And yes, it's sometimes good to try new things for sure, but keep in mind, every time you're doing something that's new to you, you're naturally gonna be slower at it. I've been following the same 7 steps for every mix that I do for over 10 years. You know, I do everything in the same order, every Pro Tools session is set up and looks the same, and I'm mostly using the same plugins in every mix. So if you wanna mix faster, you've gotta get a solid workflow down and stick with it over time. Having that workflow dialed in is also gonna allow you to use a template, which is tip number 9. So rather than dial in everything from scratch every time you start a new mix, you can just import a template and get at least 50% of the way there in a matter of minutes. I've got my mix template loaded up with all of my favorite processing chains and my effects sends all ready to go. I even have certain frequencies already set within EQ plugins and attack and release times set for the compressors. And yeah, sometimes I have to deviate from those depending on the song, but at least 80 or 90% of the time, those settings are gonna work. This leads me to the final tip for mixing faster, which is to learn the formula. And this really is the ultimate way to mix faster, because if you know what works 90% of the time and you start there, you're gonna mix a lot faster than how most people work, which is thinking, okay, should I EQ this? Well, what EQ should I use? What frequencies do I need to boost or cut? And should I compress? And should I do that before or after the EQ? And what settings, what compressor? And then they load up their list of plugins and they go through and they try 4 different compressors, trying to gauge which one is best for the material. Repeat that for all 25 tracks in your mix. And no wonder it takes people weeks to finish mixing a song. But it really shouldn't be like that. There are tried and true formulas, blueprints for EQ and compression that will get you to the sound you want if you just know what they are. A great starting point is to learn the go-to frequencies you can boost or cut for various instruments. And I've got a series of magic frequency videos that will show you exactly that. And I promise it's gonna make your stuff sound better right away. So get started by checking out one of those videos right here.